There comes a moment when even the people who once defended the narcissist begin to break under the pressure of the truth. These were the same people who listened to all the excuses, the same people who protected them in private conversations, the same people who kept saying, "Maybe they did not mean it that way. Maybe they are just struggling. Maybe the situation is more complicated than it looks." But this time, something changed completely, because eventually, everything exploded. And what happened was harsh, not emotional in a gentle way, not dramatic in a fake theatrical way, harsh in the kind of way that leaves the entire room silent afterward. Because somebody who knew every hidden detail finally reached their limit and said the words the narcissist feared hearing most. "You ruined your own life, and you did it by destroying the person who genuinely loved you." That was the exact moment everything started changing. You need to understand this very carefully today. The narcissist was ready for your sadness, ready for your tears, ready for your silence, ready for your heartbreak. But they were never ready for accountability coming from people inside their own circle. That changes everything completely. Because it is one thing when strangers begin noticing toxic behavior. It is something entirely different when someone who knows all the lies, all the cheating, all the manipulation, all the hidden confessions suddenly says, "I am done protecting you." That was the moment the entire structure started collapsing from inside. What happened next was a private confrontation so intense that the narcissist could no longer hide behind charm, excuses, blame-shifting, or victimhood. And the terrifying part for them was this: the person confronting them already knew the whole story. There was no way to twist the narrative, no way to rewrite history, no way to manipulate perception anymore. Every excuse was already dead before they even spoke it out loud. That is why this confrontation became explosive. The narcissist finally realized the truth had escaped containment. And once truth escapes containment, exposure becomes unavoidable. C.S. Lewis once wrote that we are who we believe we are when nobody is watching. That line matters deeply in this situation, because behind the public image, behind the ego, behind the pride, behind the performance, somebody finally saw who this person had really become, and they were disgusted by it. Not because the narcissist lost you, but because of what losing you revealed about them. The real shock was never simply that the relationship ended. People survive breakups every single day. The real shock was seeing who this person became afterward, because the people closest to the narcissist started noticing changes they could no longer ignore. At first, it looked like frustration, then mood swings, then stress, but eventually it became obvious that something much darker was happening beneath the surface. This person was becoming consumed by bitterness. They were angry almost all the time. Small things started triggering them. Conversations became hostile without reason. They lashed out at people who had nothing to do with the situation. Some days they completely shut down emotionally. Other days they exploded over tiny inconveniences. Their emotional instability became impossible to hide, and the people around them knew exactly when it began. After losing you. That was the part they could not escape, because deep down the people around them were beginning to understand something the narcissist desperately tried to avoid admitting. You were never the real problem. You were actually the person bringing peace into their life while they were busy creating chaos inside it. That truth became more visible after you were gone. Sometimes people fail to recognize the value of what they have until the atmosphere changes after it disappears. They do not realize who was carrying the emotional weight, who was bringing warmth, who was stabilizing the environment, until suddenly the room feels empty and cold without that person there anymore. The narcissist truly believed they could replace you easily. Their pride convinced them another person would quickly appear, another source of attention, another source of validation, another person willing to tolerate manipulation, inconsistency, and emotional games. But what they lost was not ordinary, and the people around them could finally see that clearly. They watched this person become more irritated as your life improved. They watched resentment grow every single time your name was mentioned. They watched somebody who once acted confident slowly become emotionally consumed by regret they could never publicly admit. That is why the confrontation finally exploded, because one person inside their circle became tired of hearing endless complaints, while also knowing the full truth behind the collapse. This was not somebody speaking from assumptions. This was somebody who knew the secrets. Somebody who had heard the late-night confessions, the excuses, the selfish decisions, the blame-shifting, and the private justifications. They knew how badly you had been treated, and they also knew the narcissist was trying to rewrite the story afterward. But eventually, even loyal people reach their limit, especially when they are forced to watch someone destroy themselves while still pretending to be the victim. That is what pushed this conversation into emotionally dangerous territory. The narcissist wanted sympathy. Instead, they received truth. And truth sounds brutal when somebody has spent years avoiding accountability. The person confronting them could clearly see that this was no longer simple heartbreak. This person was becoming colder, harder, and more emotionally reckless. Their anger was spilling into every area of life because unresolved guilt was quietly poisoning them from inside. That is something prideful people never understand at first. Sin does not only damage other people, it damages the person carrying it. And the people around them were finally seeing that clearly. That is why somebody finally snapped and said the words the narcissist never wanted to hear. Fix this. Not because reconciliation was guaranteed, but because everybody around them could now see the same thing. This person was collapsing under the weight of what they had done. And what terrified the narcissist most was not simply being confronted. It was realizing the people closest to them were no longer automatically defending them. The narrative was falling apart. The excuses were no longer working, and for the first time, the people around them were beginning to look at you differently too. Not as the person who lost something valuable, but as the person who escaped something deeply destructive before it completely consumed your life too. There comes a point in every narcissist's downfall where the situation stops being manageable. No more charm, no more performance, no more carefully crafted image. Only raw truth remains. And for this narcissist, that moment arrived when somebody who knew every hidden detail finally looked them directly in the face and said, "This is your fault." That sentence hit harder than the breakup itself ever could. Because narcissistic people survive through distortion. They survive by controlling perception, rewriting history, minimizing what they did, and exaggerating what others supposedly did to them. As long as they can control the narrative, they can avoid fully confronting themselves. But this time, the person sitting across from them already knew too much. They knew about the lies, the manipulation, the cheating, the emotional games, the reckless choices, and the moments the narcissist blamed you privately, while secretly admitting pieces of truth behind closed doors. That is why this confrontation became so emotionally intense. There was nowhere left to hide. Every excuse collapsed the moment it was spoken. The narcissist tried to defend themselves. They tried to explain away their behavior. They tried shifting attention toward your reactions instead of their actions. They tried bringing up your flaws so they would not have to face their own. But the person confronting them refused to let them escape accountability. That is what pushed the argument into dangerous emotional territory, because accountability feels like an attack to people who spent their entire lives avoiding it. And deep down, the narcissist understood something horrifying. In that moment, the person confronting them no longer believed the version of reality they had been selling. That changes everything, because once the people closest to a narcissist stop protecting the illusion, the collapse speeds up fast. This was not some outsider criticizing them, not gossip, not rumors, not opinions from strangers online. This was somebody from inside their own world, somebody who had watched everything unfold closely, and instead of offering comfort, they finally exploded. You are angry because you destroyed your own life. That was the truth the narcissist could not emotionally handle, not because it was false, but because it was painfully accurate. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a prideful person realize they can no longer manipulate the people around them. You can almost feel the panic underneath the anger, the loss of control, the desperation to regain power over the narrative. But it was already too late. The truth had spread too far. And the more they tried defending themselves, the more obvious their guilt became. That is what happens when somebody spends too long building their life on pride instead of honesty. Eventually, the contradictions become visible to everyone around them. But pride has a fatal weakness. It blinds people to the damage they are creating until the damage becomes impossible to reverse. That is exactly where this person is standing now. And the frightening part is that the people around them are beginning to see it too. The manipulation no longer sounds convincing. The victim act no longer feels believable. The excuses no longer carry weight. Everything is beginning to crack apart. Many of you listening to this did not lose your peace when the narcissist lied about you. You stayed quiet. You stayed grounded. You let God handle what you could not force yourself. And now, the same people who once listened to the narcissist are beginning to see what you saw from the beginning, and the narcissist can feel it. That is why they are becoming more defensive, more irritated, and more emotionally unstable. They are watching their ability to control perceptions slowly disappear, and they do not know how to function without that control. Because once truth enters the room, manipulation begins suffocating. And for the first time in a very long time, this person is being forced to sit face to face with the consequences of who they became. One of the hardest realities for the narcissist was not losing access to you. It was watching you rise after they expected you to completely fall apart. That was the part nobody prepared them for. Somewhere in their mind, they truly believed your life would collapse without them in it. They believed the confusion they created inside you would last forever. They believed the emotional damage, manipulation, rejection, and betrayal would permanently weaken your spirit. But instead of collapsing, you started rebuilding yourself. You started rediscovering who you were again. And the more your life improved, the more emotionally unstable they became. Not because you were hurting them intentionally, but because your healing exposed how badly they underestimated your value. That is the hidden truth underneath all their anger. Every time they hear about your success, something inside them tightens emotionally. Every time they see you becoming stronger, calmer, more confident, more peaceful, and more grounded, they are forced to confront a reality their pride tried desperately to avoid. They lost somebody rare. That realization becomes unbearable for people who only recognize value after absence, because while they had you, they were distracted by ego, distracted by attention, distracted by the belief that they always had more time, more options, and more control. They treated your loyalty like something ordinary because they assumed your presence was guaranteed forever. Now they are discovering what life actually feels like without the person who brought emotional stability into it. And the people around them can clearly see it. That is why this confrontation became so emotionally intense. The person arguing with them could see the connection between your growth and the narcissist's emotional deterioration. They could see how deeply your healing was affecting them psychologically. Not because they still controlled you, but because they no longer could. That loss of control is devastating for narcissistic people, especially when the person they underestimated begins thriving without them. The narcissist wanted to believe your success was temporary. They wanted to believe your confidence was fake, your peace was an act, and your happiness was exaggerated. But over time, the evidence became impossible to deny. You were genuinely moving forward while they were becoming more bitter. That contrast started exposing everything. The more your life improved, the harder it became for them to keep pretending they made the right decision. The distractions stopped working the way they once did. Even their pride stopped comforting them the same way, and the people around them started recognizing the regret hidden underneath the anger. Because regret changes a person's energy completely. It makes them reactive, restless, emotionally sharp around the edges. And according to the people around them, this narcissist had become extremely difficult to be around. Conversations always circled back to resentment. Their mood darkened whenever your name came up. They became irritated by your success because your success reminded them of the future they destroyed with their own hands. That is what the person confronting them finally exploded about. At some point during the argument, the truth became impossible to avoid. If you had treated them right, your life would look completely different right now. That sentence cut deeper than anything else, because deep down, the narcissist already knew it was true. They know they had somebody genuine, somebody loyal, somebody who tried to love them honestly despite all the confusion they created. But instead of protecting that connection, they sabotaged it. Now they are forced to watch from the outside while your life continues expanding without them in it. And what makes this even more painful for them is that your growth did not come from revenge. It came from release. You stopped carrying their chaos. You stopped chasing explanations. You stopped begging for clarity. You stopped trying to save somebody committed to misunderstanding you. And once you stopped pouring your energy into surviving their instability, your life finally began changing for the better. That is what they could never fully understand emotionally. Because narcissistic people often confuse your exhaustion with weakness. They mistake your patience for dependency. They mistake your love as something they can keep hurting forever without consequences. But once your spirit finally disconnects emotionally, the whole situation changes. Now they are standing outside the peace they once had access to, and everyone around them can notice the difference. The warmth disappeared. The stability disappeared. All that remains now is pride, regret, and the painful realization that they traded something genuine for temporary ego. That is why watching you succeed feels unbearable to them, because your healing became proof that they were never the source of your value. Their own secrets also started working against them. One of the most damaging parts of this entire situation is that the narcissist was not destroyed by gossip. They were destroyed by truths they had already admitted privately. That is the part they never expected. Because people like this often believe secrecy means protection. They think that as long as certain conversations stay hidden, they can continue controlling how others view them. They divide their life into separate parts: One version for the public and another version behind closed doors. But eventually, those separate parts begin crashing into each other, and when that happens, everything changes very quickly. The person confronting the narcissist already knew far too much. They knew about the cheating, the manipulation, the emotional mind games, the moments where the narcissist admitted what they had done but still expected sympathy afterward. They knew how many times this person defended hurting you while refusing to admit the damage they caused. That is why the narcissist became so defensive during the argument, not because they were innocent, but because they realized their usual tactics were no longer effective. They could not rewrite the story with somebody who had already heard the truth directly from them. Imagine the fear of realizing the person sitting across from you remembers every contradiction, every confession, every excuse, every moment where your mask slipped in private. That is what made this confrontation emotionally brutal. For years, the narcissist depended on confusion to maintain control. If people stayed uncertain, they could keep manipulating perception. But clarity entered the room during this argument, and once clarity enters, manipulation immediately starts losing power. Every attempt to blame you was shut down. Every excuse fell apart. Every attempt to act misunderstood failed. Slowly, the narcissist began realizing something terrifying. The people around them were no longer instantly taking their side. That kind of exposure deeply shakes a narcissistic person because their identity depends heavily on outside validation. They need supporters. They need enablers. They need people willing to repeat their version of events without questioning it too deeply. But once somebody close to them finally says, "No, I know what really happened," the illusion starts cracking everywhere else too. That is why this person became more irritated and emotional. They could feel control slipping away. And underneath all the anger was fear. Fear that people were beginning to compare the narcissist's words with their actions. Fear that the inconsistencies were becoming obvious. Fear that the image they spent years protecting was starting to collapse from within. What makes this even more powerful is that you did not force this exposure yourself. You did not have to chase people down. You did not have to scream your innocence. You did not have to destroy your own peace trying to convince everyone what happened. The truth started revealing itself naturally because deception becomes harder to maintain over time, especially when the person living dishonestly becomes emotionally unstable under pressure. That instability exposes everything. Eventually, people start noticing the bitterness, the resentment, the constant anger, the inability to move on peacefully. Slowly, they begin asking themselves an uncomfortable question. If this person was truly innocent, why are they falling apart like this? That question alone changes everything. Because once people start privately questioning the narcissist, the foundation underneath the false image begins weakening rapidly. Deep down, the narcissist knows it. That is why this confrontation affected them so deeply. Not because somebody yelled at them, but because somebody who knew the truth finally stopped protecting the lie. One of the most painful moments in this entire collapse happened quietly. Not during the yelling, not during the confrontation, not during the anger, but afterward, when the narcissist was left alone with reality. Because once the argument ended and the emotions settled, one truth remained heavily sitting in the room. You were never the enemy. That realization is devastating for somebody who spent so much time convincing themselves otherwise. For a long time, the narcissist needed you to carry the blame emotionally. They needed to believe you were difficult, unforgiving, dramatic, impossible to satisfy, or somehow responsible for the chaos they created. That false narrative protected their pride. It allowed them to avoid looking honestly at their own behavior. But the people around them were no longer supporting that illusion. Little by little, the narcissist started recognizing something deeply disturbing. The anger they carried toward you was never truly about you. It was about themselves, about the choices they made, the opportunities they wasted, the loyalty they mishandled, the love they took for granted. That is why your success affects them so deeply now, because every peaceful step you take forces them to face how unnecessary the destruction really was. You were not trying to destroy them, you were trying to love them. That truth has become impossible for them to escape. The person confronting the narcissist saw this clearly. They could see that the narcissist had spent so much time blaming you that they never stopped asking themselves why they were still emotionally falling apart long after the relationship ended. If you were truly the problem, why were they still consumed by bitterness? Why were they still obsessed with your life? Why were they still reacting emotionally every time your name was mentioned? Those questions started exposing everything, because healed people do not remain emotionally trapped in hatred forever. Only guilty people do that. Deep down, the narcissist knows guilt is following them everywhere now. It follows them into quiet moments, into conversations, into sleepless nights, into memories they can no longer completely suppress. Especially the memories of who you were before the betrayal changed everything. That is another reason this truth is destroying them internally. The more emotionally unstable they become, the more clearly they remember your patience, your honesty, and your willingness to love them even when they were difficult to love. Now those memories no longer comfort them, they accuse them. That is what happens when somebody finally understands they were given something real and destroyed it through pride, selfishness, and emotional immaturity. And the people around them are beginning to understand it too. The narcissist can feel the shift happening. They can feel people becoming less sympathetic, less convinced by the excuses, less willing to automatically support their side. That loss of support terrifies them, because narcissistic people survive through reinforcement. They need people constantly validating their perspective so they do not have to face themselves honestly. But that reinforcement is weakening now, and without it, the truth becomes much louder internally. That is why they seem more emotionally reactive than ever, more defensive, more unstable, more consumed by frustration they cannot fully explain. Because underneath all the anger is grief. Not only grief over losing you, but grief over realizing they became the very thing that destroyed their own happiness. And that realization is beginning to follow them everywhere. One of the most powerful parts of this entire situation is that somebody finally stood up and said what should have been said a long time ago. You did not deserve what happened to you. That matters more than people realize. Because when someone survives narcissistic abuse, one of the deepest wounds is not only the betrayal itself, but also the isolation afterward. The feeling that nobody completely understands what happened behind closed doors. The frustration of watching the narcissist maintain appearances while you quietly carry the emotional damage. But something changed here. The person who once listened to the narcissist's excuses finally stopped enabling them and started defending you instead. That is a major turning point. Not because you needed validation to know your worth, but because truth eventually reaches people who are willing to see honestly. And once that truth reaches them, they cannot ignore it anymore. The person confronting the narcissist remembered how you treated them. They remembered your patience,